Falling Walls Circle, Challenges and Foresight.
Welcome to the Falling Walls Plenary Table, how generative AI can revolutionize therapy development.
Hello there, I'm Mariette DiChristina. I'm Dean at Boston University's College of Communication and also a professor of journalism. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. I thought it would be fun, in the spirit of things, to ask ChatGPT to write a short intro for you. I'm going to look down while I read it to you. It's just a couple of sentences. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel discussion on the transformative potential of generative AI in healthcare. Today, we'll explore how artificial intelligence is advancing innovative therapies and bringing us closer to realizing their great promise. Join us as we dive into the groundbreaking possibilities that AI holds for the future of healthcare and patient well-being. Not bad. Now, I'd love you all to put your hands together to help me welcome all of our speakers as I invite them to the stage to join me now. Please come up. Thank you all. Just a quick hello, and the folks who are joining me here are Allison Duettmann, President and CEO of Foresight Institute. Welcome, great to see you. Monika Lessl, Executive Director of the Bayer Foundation and Senior VP at Bayer AG, responsible for corporate R&D, social innovation, and societal engagement. Great to have you here. And then to my right, Mads Nørregaard-Madsen, co-founder of Revolution and currently driving ML, AI, and DEL technologies for small molecule research at Amgen. Great to have you. And now to my left, David Ruau, who is leading strategic scientific partnership in healthcare and life science across EMEA at NVIDIA. Great to have you. And certainly last not least, Johan Trygg, Head of Advanced Data Analytics Corporate Research at Sartorius and a full professor of chemometrics at Umeå University. How lovely to have you today. So let's get right to it by starting with the basics. How can generative AI advance discoveries to developing novel therapies? What areas are your companies focusing on and why? Would anyone like to start us off? John, please.
I can start. I think generative AI will have the chance to transform how medicines are made today. I think it has a huge opportunity to understand disease, find targets, find molecules to block or interact with those targets, but also help with the precision medicine idea of identifying subgroups of populations or even individual patients for treatment. I think we also have to recognize the why now. And it is the why now is because we are able to analyze and understand data at scale. So huge amounts of data related to biology is available, but also the data science tools to analyze those data is available. So that combination, I think, is the key why we're also sitting at this table today.
Well, I think I can speak from a more general perspective, perhaps. I don't have a company, but we have different research tracks across biotechnology, molecular nanotechnology, neurotechnology, and you have it. And I think across all of these areas within the last 8 years, it's been slowly ramping up, and now in the last 2 years, really drastically accelerating, I think, progress across these areas. And I think two things are, interesting to note. On the one hand, I think, since AlphaFold 2, you then had tools like Rosetta really building up from the Baker Lab. And I think in that sense, it can help us really to look and analyze systems that we don't have good intuitions for as human beings, because they're either very small, very complex. There's a lot of just things happening, which we can't intuit well. And so I think looking at that, modeling it, simulating it, predicting it to some extent, I think that's really, really useful across different domains. And then the second thing is that, even just on the research assistance side, right? We've all asked ChatGPT before, I bet a bunch of different things, but there are now different things, for example, like Brain GPT, that is really a GPT that's focused on neuro research, right? And you can really ask it what types of experiments could I run, which would be likely successful, what experiments have been run in this area, and it can really give you pretty good and much less hallucinatory proposals there. And I'm sure people have used Perplexity AI or like Elicit, like all these research assistant tools are, I think, really interesting. And obviously there was the OpenAI demo day yesterday, so I think there's a lot more coming down the line. But I think in these two areas, I see definitely like a lot of just progress across the different fields we focus on.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It has the potential to revolutionize development of new therapies. So maybe let's group this in 3 areas. One is, of course, everything that is connected with text. Yeah? So just one example is, of course, looking for new literature and then, of course, identifying new starting molecules, so-called targets. That's, of course, way easier using generative AI. But then also, once you have finished a clinical study, then you have to make these clinical study reports. And that's really time-consuming. It takes about 3 months. And this is something definitely also generative AI will help to speed up that process and make it really fast forward to prepare all that materials which you have then to give to the regulatory authorities. Yeah? So this is about, the speech, and there are many more examples. Then the other one is also about pictures. Yeah? So we also, in our radiology business, it's sometimes a challenge that we don't have enough data in terms of pictures in order to train the system appropriately. And there, the use of synthetic data. Yeah? So, for example, we made synthetic data on breast images. Yeah? So of diseased and undiseased people. So, and with this, you can also train then the system and therefore have a better accuracy later on in the assistance of the medical doctors to identify a new tumor. So I think that's also a huge advantage. And then the third part is really related to data, yeah, as you said. I mean, is it either structural biology or, I mean, also nowadays, can we, from expression patterns, use them and identify hit molecules, yeah, so translate that knowledge. So I think that's really, I mean, we are at the very beginning, but just concrete examples where it will help and speed up the process for sure.
Yeah, and for me, working with the early stage of finding new drugs, it's quite obvious that it allows us to pick some of the high-hanging fruits, and finding new drugs, developing new drugs is a marginal gains exercise where even months can mean a difference when you want to bring something to the market. So it's definitely doing already now a difference and will make even bigger in the future. But on the other hand, I also think we have to be honest and say we have been taken a little bit by surprise. I think this is one of the times where you have to realize that the methodology and the models are ahead of the data. So often that is the challenge, that these methodologies, they require a lot of data and they require high quality data. So that means that we also have to look at a cultural change in the companies with the scientists, realizing that you actually have to create data in order to build models, and not the other way around, that you have data and then you can just build models on top of that. So there's a lot of work ahead, both on the technological side, but also adoption of AI and ML in discovery.
Thank you for having me here today. First of all, it's a great pleasure. So in my role at NVIDIA, I'm a bit fortunate that I work with a tremendous amount of companies which are innovating into this particular space. Allison, you mentioned Rosetta Fold and the others. I just heard this morning that a new company got funded and they could not have folded the protein and find basically the docking ligand without those algorithms. It would have taken 20 years, according to what they said. It's so where will AI change healthcare is definitely in every single domain. Would it be from docking to summarizing patient notes to understand better? We will use those tools to understand better what is around us, what is the amount of publication telling us. I mean, it's really, I mean, what Monika, you said, I mean, exactly true. We all remember our PhD days when you have to read papers on papers, and what do you really remember from that? It's, so there is many applications of it. I think it will expand our capacity to go faster toward new medicine. And also improve the health of patient and the ability of patient to see a light at the end of the day for them. That's my take on it.
Thank you. I especially like ending on the patient benefit. Let's take a little deeper dive. I really appreciate everybody's initial thoughts on the positive side. But let's talk a little bit more about the challenges in using generative AI and to develop and manufacture novel therapies. For instance, I understand that generative AI alone hasn't yet been able to result in a single approved drug molecule. Do we understand diseases well enough to train generative AI in the first place? And Mads, maybe we can start with you since you raised this concern in your initial remarks as well.
Yeah, I think first of all, we just have to realize that it's a tool, right? There is not at the moment any AI that will come with a simple solution to these problems. That's simply not, that's too naive. But when you apply it where the data is there, where there is high quality data, then you're making small changes that all together will make a big change. And I think that's how you have to approach it. I mean, in big pharma, we have a lot of data, but we basically didn't create the data such that it was ready for AI. So it's almost as big a task to curate those data than actually creating them again. And I think if you are not in a big pharma, but if you are a small startup, that's actually where the window of opportunity is, because you can basically make the data that fits the AI. So I think we will see that there are companies that will take that opportunity and build on that. A big pharma will definitely also get there, but it's a lot of things that need to change, both the mindset, but also the investments in turning the data that we have into something that can be used for really predictive AI. I think it's probably not where we see it right now. It will make a big difference. I think it's different places where it will make a difference, but we can. I think that's more like when we come to the costs and things like that, where it will have an impact.
Go on, and then David.
Yeah, go ahead, David. Sorry.
It's, I mean, this particular statistic that no drug yet has hit the market, AI-generated drug has hit the market, is a bit of misleading news in my respect. I have been basically a researcher for a very long time. Before I joined NVIDIA, I was at Bayer, in fact. And we already use computational biology tools since decades. I did my PhD on that. So the topic is that you don't create one drug with one tool. It's a combination of, it's an entire story that takes 10, 20 years to develop, really. So it's blaming that AI might not be the holy grail for creating new drug is misleading. I think it's a very useful tool within basically an ecosystem. That's what I wanted to say, yeah.
To address the challenges, which I also recognize, I'm just not an optimistic idiot in that sense. I recognize also that the challenge is also we're trying to understand biology and medicine and disease. And that's the hardest language of all, at least what we've encountered so far. It's much easier to analyze text, which we're also impressed by with this ChatGPT. And people are saying that maybe we can write the ChatGPT prompt, but call it medicine GPT to create a molecule with very specific properties, just like you can do with ChatGPT. I think we're far off from that. I think the tools that you mentioned are more advanced because they come from other domains which have accessed much other types of data, much more rich type of data for those categories, but not in the biology area. So I think we're still, and you still have to acknowledge that you can come up with a molecule that looks good in the lab or in the test models, even though you use very high-end and precision sort of organoids tools. You still have to make it molecule, you still have to develop the assays, you still have to validate it through the regulatory bodies. And that still is the work, the same work as before. And I think that's important to stress. It's not just an AI development. You still have the same, as you pointed to, David, that you still have the same package you need to deliver, which I think is healthy at this stage. We don't go ourselves away ahead of the AI hype.
Maybe I can add there also, I think it's also important that there is not the one AI. Yeah? I mean, it really is dependent on what you need it for. Yeah? Like, for example, if you want to identify hits, then of course you have that system that has been trained with relevant data. Yeah? And, but then also, I mean, we face the challenge, for example, we know that about 50% of the data that are being published cannot be reproduced. Yeah? So, and that's also a huge challenge. I mean, this reproducibility crisis. Yeah? So that means that the data quality might not be as good as we assume it is. Yeah? And then, of course, you using AI, you will just build on these data which are not as good. So I think the curation of data and what gets into the training of the system, that's a key point, and this will also determine the output. And I think this is true for data, preclinical data which are being published, but it's also unfortunately true for clinical data. Yeah? So where we also know that part of the data that are being published are just faked, invented, whatever. Yeah? And so this is an intrinsic challenge, and the more data we use, then we continue to build on these data, and that's something we really need to look at to make sure that we have a good and well-curated system as an input to train the systems and then to make the output. But that's a lot of work and very tedious.
Sorry.
No, go for it.
I think a statement there would be, we need to generate the data for the machine learning models. I think what is existing today are data generated for the biologist or the people, the biochemist, for instance. And I think that's a mind shift that we have to really go back from the drawing board and say, which data do we need to serve these models in order to make these assessments and assumptions?
Yeah, I mean, if I can pile on like 3 other points on the data discussion is, I think, the quality of data and like, perhaps actually like looking at like what do we need, not just what do we have. Yeah. But then I think a different one is just like, often there's like, we could have data, but we don't because we don't publish that data. Or like, from, let's say, even like failed trials, it would be nice to also have some more incentives to like actually learn from other people's mistakes and not always just replicate them. That would be useful to know. I think like sometimes like we could have already data, but it's like, it's not accessible. And other times, we have the data, but due to privacy concerns and like, oftentimes, especially healthcare data is super sensitive, right? You're exposing not only yourself, but also your family in some instances. And I think I'm very much in favor of privacy for this type of, for that data, but there are sometimes new ways in which we could perhaps use differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, like different cryptographic approaches to actually kind of like nevertheless perhaps analyze some of the metadata across different patient groups, especially for rare diseases. I see people all the time, like on different forums online, just like, hey, has anyone tried this? It's like always N of 1 sometimes, for these things. So I think like making sure that we also kind of like use the data that we have in a way that is obviously privacy preserving, but like I think there are approaches to that. They're very new, but we should look there more. And then I think finally the part that you mentioned, also a little bit the standardization, like, and just oftentimes, even within one discipline, you have like people using entirely different metrics for things. Especially if you're trying to do something a bit interdisciplinary, it's like really difficult to actually like square different kind of like data packages. Like metrics are not always, I think, really combinable in a way, and if we want to make it accessible for AI, we need to have like relatively standardized data sets that you can use in different ways. And there are like standardization efforts, like I'm on like a biomarker for aging executive committee, so people are trying, especially for aging, for example. It's if you want to get going on especially those types of interventions, there is not really like a biomarker for aging at all yet, right? Different aging tests give you different results, like glycan age, Elysium, what have you, and different interventions fare differently well on different tests. So there's a lot of individual incentives from different individual players to like, say that this is the correct biomarker, like let's say for aging or for whatever you may have. But I think more standardization also, and that's also a social problem, and that can come from all of us to some extent. It would be good to have some metrics that more people could agree on that are accessible to AI.
Small comment. I mean, what I'm really trying to preach for the scientists in our company is that they've been used to that the data they create are for immediate consumption. That day is over. I mean, they never know what the data will be needed for later on. So it's really important that they get that understanding that it's not only about getting information about what does this molecule do in this assay. No, you actually building the future for what we want to do. So that's a change of mindset that we need to teach each and every scientist.
Yeah, really quick follow-up on this, because I think this is a fascinating area of promise, right, and challenge. That AI itself, as Monika mentioned, is not one but many, depending on the problem you're trying to solve, and that there are many challenges around data, making it, cleaning it, making it standardized, finding what data we need. Is there anybody that you might mention who's doing a great model of, we didn't talk about open data necessarily, but it's sort of implicit in there too, scientists sharing data with each other. If anybody has a quick thought on a good model you've seen, that would be great to hear.
I think it is an absolutely challenge often to share health data because of all the privacy concerns. Yeah? But there again, I think the system can help, because you can now make out of that data synthetic data, so which has maybe some similar statistical properties and so on and so forth, which you can then use. And that is, it's a proxy, it's not perfect, but it really helps maybe to spur that exchange, because we have lots of data, be it in the healthcare system, be it in hospitals, be it in insurance companies, but it's not accessible for research, so because there is a big hesitancy. So now, but if we can transfer that into synthetic data, again, it's not perfect, but at least is a way maybe to easily share, more easily share data. So I think that's a good example.
Thank you.
I think the model is already there, right? Federated learning has been there for a while, and I think it will work. Some of the challenges has again been about the data, that they are not comparable. But I think the principle of how we can do this is already there.
Yeah, OpenMind is a great, you're familiar with OpenMind, they're a really wonderful community, basically onboarding people to more federated learning, homomorphic encryption, I think some differential privacy, basically just onboarding people to different ways of how you can compute on data without actually having to see the data itself, but you can still analyze it on a meta level, and they do fantastic work. I very much recommend checking them out.
Thank you. So let's start to think a little bit about the future and what happens if these AI-derived therapies are successful. Could I ask what the potential impact on cost is from your perspectives if they're successful?
I can start out. I think we have to be realistic. It's not getting cheaper to develop drugs. It's going to be as expensive or maybe even more expensive. But there will be an impact on cost, because as AI matures, I think what we will see is that, especially for diseases, rare diseases, and it's already happening, right? That companies are trying to look at how do you then combine drugs. And being able to combine drugs to get an effect requires that you integrate many types of data, genomics data. I just heard the talk about the cell atlas earlier today. Those kind of data, when you start integrating those, then you start to actually being able to predict what kind of drug combination should you use. And there it will typically be drugs which are already old and is cheap to produce. In that sense, I think there will be an impact on cost, but maybe on smaller disease areas, rare diseases and things like that. But I think in general, it would be naive to think that drug discovery is going to be cheaper because of AI.
Maybe I'm a little bit more optimistic there. I think on the molecule development side, we will reduce the number of failures, hopefully. So this E-rooms law that we have, that's the inverse of what computers are sort of the logarithmic scale, but we have a downward turn for the development of drugs. I think if we are less failing, maybe there's a cost reduction there in terms of people, in terms of failures. And maybe we can build on those as building blocks for the next generation of portfolio of medicines rather than doing one by one. The other one we have to recognize is a high cost in the manufacturing and development of these drugs on a global scale. And I think there, at least from our side, we're looking at how can we connect the molecule development with the process of manufacturing. And this is a huge task, but if we're able to, you can say, modularize that, maybe then the cost reduction will come, but also the regulatory industry could adopt different perspectives and guidelines then in how this manufacturing is being done. And that may also speed up the process, which also would reduce the cost. So faster to market and reduce cost. But that's a huge challenge, and we're not there yet.
There is so developing the drug, we need to understand that there is a component which is in silico, basically. So this part could be reduced because we could go faster, we could have better algorithm to invent those new drugs, testing them, doing more of the cellular assay in silico, in fact, by learning from them, learning from the past. But the next step is really to prove that it works in human, and that is not in silico. So this part will still be a constant, and will only follow basically the inflation at least in terms of cost. That said, within my domain, so of AI really, what we need is to pay attention that researchers have access to enough compute power to invent those algorithm of tomorrow. And that is something I see across different governments in Europe. It's a bit of a race to develop the infrastructure for those companies, startups, academics, to develop this new algorithm. It's essential to pay attention to that, otherwise the competitiveness of our ecosystem will be reduced. Yeah.
And we've seen the impact if we all focus on one thing, like with the COVID-19 vaccines. We were surprised with how fast we could actually come up with a drug and a vaccine and manufacture that on a global scale. I'm not saying it's comparable because it's through a different modality, but I think still we should recognize that we should be surprised in the future, not today know what the impact will be.
Yeah, maybe also, I think from my perspective, the cost aspect is one, but on the other hand, it's also a question how far can you leverage it across your organization. And there, I think one aspect we have not spoken about is how do you upskill the people so that they can really use it and leverage it. Yeah? So not everybody is familiar with it, and not every scientist knows what question to ask. Yeah? And there, I think, so we started also some years ago a program, and I think David was still there. Yeah, we called it a Tech Immersion Program, which was really bringing together scientists and data scientists, and then working on concrete challenges. Yeah, so in that field, and then giving them some support on entrepreneurial thinking, because you have to be also an entrepreneur. How can you make that? How can you address the challenge in an entrepreneurial way? And then move that forward. But it's also understanding the language. The scientists need to understand what question can I ask. The data scientists need to get the knowledge on the biology. And so I think this exchange and how you can really, the better you get this, break down the silos and get people together, the more you can leverage it. Yeah? So otherwise it will be just individual use cases which you don't leverage the full potential going forward. And be it AI or generative AI, I think it doesn't matter in the end. Yeah.
Thank you, Monika. Let's keep with this theme of looking forward and what we need next. How do we get to the next stage with these experimental treatments, and what regulatory and ethical questions do we need to address to do so?
I'll start with one thing we need. We need people who are trained on this topic. And I think today we have silos. We have some people reflecting that it's the computer scientist's job to find these models, or the biologist's job to understand. I think we need to have those in one person, much more at scale than today. So I think universities, if I look at them, myself also having relations with them, we need to really reinvest in how we provide education for the future workforce to work in this field. Because we have too little talent today, and we won't be successful enough if we don't accelerate that and improve that. So people is one I would like to mention.
Yeah, I mean, I would perhaps also build up on the point that you already mentioned of, like it is so expensive and so complex to take anything, like in the US context, to the FDA. I mean, it is, wow, really like songs should be written about this, in the sense that the kind of like horror stories that people sometimes tell me of just is it is, I think, that is a big point that is not AI related, but it's a social and institutional innovation, I think, issue. And, I think that much of what the FDA is is doing is really, really wonderful. But I think especially on a few things, like there could be just much more institutional innovation. I think especially as our processes for innovating are changing, I think also the institutions need to adapt to be able to perhaps fast track. We've seen it in COVID, it's possible, we can fast track things. And I think working a bit closer with regulators and with policy innovators, I think is something that we need to kind of also take it upon ourselves to go out and build these bridges. And oftentimes they're willing, there is a lot of, I think, institutional gridlock sometimes, but I think oftentimes that they're willing, and we need to kind of approach people as well. And it has worked on some instances for us well in the past. And I think, there are then other models too. For example, I think, at least in the US context, many people are now looking elsewhere, perhaps, to perhaps not develop in the US. And there's, for example, even a charter city in Honduras, Prosper, where some gene companies are going, just to get away from the FDA. And I think if we want to keep and retain talent, we need to also, I think, innovate from a US context here right now on how we support this talent and how easy we make it to get through different stages. And I think, for example, Singapore, I think, has an interesting model here, from what I hear at least. They are working much closer with regulators in the sense that many of the policy regulators, they are joining many of the technology conferences often. And there's a much more of a dialogue between them, and it's not just kind of two sides that are standing at different angles. Ultimately, I think we want the same things. And we need to kind of I think, look at these processes big time and just see what we can change there. And on the other hand, that also comes with the opposite commitment of people working on these science and technologies to also really kind of work on these with a risk mind focus already in place. I think oftentimes people that work on that stuff are also good people to kind of predict a little bit what could be dangerous here, what could be risky here. And I think if we totally kind of silo these two things, I think it doesn't work, right? Then we work against each other. But I think it comes with a scientific commitment also to figure out are there any differential technology paths that we can do first? Are there any risks that I can perhaps already predict and work on a different angle on this or something? I think it's a kind of double-edged, it must be a two-way commitment, I think, or a two-way promise, I think, to get innovation here.
I think from the regulatory, we have to acknowledge it's a big step for them, because this is something typically you inject in the human body. And so in the medical devices healthcare industry, their AI and these generative AIs have been used a lot, and they're getting more and more approved. So they are actually sort of getting approved. On the biologic side, for instance, that I represent, there will still be a huge sort of educational effort needed on both sides to align and to come up with new guidelines. Because at the moment, I think it would still struggle for the regulator to pass an AI-only derived molecule. And so if you want to speed that up, we need to talk to them a lot as well and educate on both sides. This is not just for us to teach someone else, it's for us to learn what are the things we need to change in order to adopt these for regulatory approval. Yeah.
David, you were waiting patiently.
So, I mean, on the regulatory aspect of AI models that we are, so that people use our technology to develop. In fact, there is a movement to develop technology that will avoid misuse of those, for example, large language model. The large language model are, that you all know it, that the GPT style type of model, OpenAI is developing a lot of companies are developing large language model. OpenAI is just the most well-known one. But you can prevent misuse. The thing is that the policy should potentially enforce that those guardrail, which is the technology is called guardrail, should prevent basically those misuse of large language model. Yeah. But it's a technology which is emerging also. It's not perfect, and we need to cope with it. We need to compensate this view with the fact that we can already use other tools which are freely available, Google, which can be put to bad use in a way. I mean, the knowledge is there, out there, if you want to do something wrong. And so in this respect, it's not this new tool that AI, generative AI, which is making a big change. It's just, it makes it potentially more, easier to reach more knowledge, which has been already laying around, in fact.
Yeah, maybe. I think a lot of things have been said, but I think one thing is really to build trust. Yeah? This is a new technology, A lot of people are afraid of it, and so I think that's something also key. I mean, how can we be transparent on the use? And so something we did is also we established a bioethics council to support us not only on AI, but also on other new technologies, be it cell and gene therapy, stem cell therapy, but also on AI. So in order to think about it, what are the rules? How do we govern AI within the company? Yeah? So is the rule book? Yeah, that everybody has to follow. And of course, that's not an easy task, but so it's at least our approach to have someone like a sounding board. So they are not taking any decisions, but it's a sounding board. And if you have concrete cases, they can also help you to discuss and see what are the options there. Yeah? But I really think it's very important to build trust within the organization, but also outside on all these new technologies. Otherwise, we lose our license to operate as scientists going forward.
Thank you. I think we need to take a couple of audience questions from online and in the room. Mads, I'm probably going to come back to you because you didn't get a chance. Yeah.
Thank you, Mariette. So just a reminder, if you have a question, please raise your hand nice and high so we can get a microphone to you. Or if you're online, just drop it in the chat. So first question from the chat is, where is the bottleneck? But I would actually change that question a bit because we've already heard quite a few. What is the biggest bottleneck? Perhaps we can reflect on.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I'd go again. I think the bottleneck has been access to endpoint clinical, or you can say biology data. So if you talk about cancer, access to the I'm not saying clinical in terms of the diagnosis data itself, but more the histopathology images or something that connects to the phenotype of the individual or of the population in that group. I think you need some, because typically these are supervised models, which means you need some endpoint target. And if you don't have that as a guiding star when you make these, build these sort of models, you're basically fishing. You're not really sure what you'll get. So we see the ones who we think are quite successful now are the ones who has a clear end-to-end analysis pipeline of the data, accessing also, you can say, biomedical data. And what they claim is the histopathological data in terms of cancer seems to be very useful for machine learning.
I would agree. We really need to see it as we need to establish end-to-end experimentation when we want to apply AI. And so we need to design it in a way so we can build the AI on it. I think that's going to be the key. But it's also the bottleneck because it's expensive to set up, and it also requires training of people. There's actually not a lot of people who can lead those kind of teams that can do end-to-end experimentation and the data pipelines associated with that. So, education.
I see we also have a question from an audience member just over here.
Hello. Thank you very much. My name is Tim Flink. I work as scientific advisor in the German Parliament for the Social Democratic Party. And I'm backing Rupert Stuwe, who is rapporteur on health research, digitalization, and research data. As some of you might know, there are a couple of laws and acts in preparation, the Research Data Act and the German Health Data Act, which is somehow backing the European health data space. My question to you, especially to you, Monika, would be, how do you assess specifically the access conditions to health data? Because what we always get as feedback, both from public as well as private science, is that there's almost something like a rat race as regards to the question, where in which countries can you get the best access to patient data, where can it be shared? And that is a development that some might even associate with a dystopian scenario that which is for health reasons not good, because you need a diversified spread of different phenotypes, biomarkers, etc. But it could also become something ungood regarding the rights of patients. So how do you assess the international landscape of countries that give access or have higher barriers to find access points to patient data. Sorry, this was a bit too long, but...
Yeah, I think having access to the data always needs an informed consent from the patients, yeah? And I think this is the prerequisite we work with, yeah? And I think you all know it's a bit a challenge. I mean, you often get the informed consent on a very specific study that is being followed, but then not the very broad consent, which means you can use the data for whatever you want. And this, of course, hinders then also the research in a broader sense, because at that moment, maybe you don't know what else you could do with the data later on. Yeah? So that's, I think, it's still a challenge, and it may need also further education of patients. But there, I think that maybe the synthetic data could really help, yeah? So that you can use maybe these data and they are no longer connected to an individual person, and then feed it into the systems. Yeah? So I think it's not a perfect way, but at least it could be a way to go forward without identifying the individual in any way. Yeah? So I think that's the way we are currently looking at. Yeah? Mm-hmm.
I would like also to mention that there is not only patient data and health record that are important for science. So working with Johan and Amgen also, the topic is about accessing proteins sequence. It's about accessing docking pose for drugs and proteins. Those data are not sensitive for patient. They don't risk anything. They are proprietary, yes, sometimes. They are sensitive, they are competitive, yes. That's a problem we can address. There's no restriction around basically sharing this type of sequence. We have example, I mean, the protein data bank is online. You can download every sequence from protein of the human body. So competitiveness and acceptance also go by fostering the right access to other type of data, which are easier to get to, less regulated, because they don't need regulation. So that can also influence the debate and make people understand, okay, there are different type of data around.
Well, for both of the points, I think, that you brought up, I think there's also potential, I guess, interesting problems and solutions. Like, I think for the one that you mentioned, there are things like potential data trusts, or, like, really like kind of like coordination mechanisms by which people can basically like band together and like, selectively share access to data, perhaps even get rewarded. I mean, it's still, a relatively theoretical concept. I think we could get there if we get the coordination mechanisms in place. And that, I think, would help both the patients by benefiting from the kind of like analysis on specific things that they want to know about, but it would also help research a lot further. If you could contact someone in a privacy preserving way, obviously, all of it. But that would help, I think. And what you mentioned, yeah, of course, like for some of that, it's not really like the patient privacy that's a problem here, but I think for some of these things, you may worry about biorisks or, about other things, about abuse, misuse of technologies. And I think they're thinking about like access points, or thinking about perhaps even like ways in which we, like, there's a wonderful project, Secure DNA, and MIT and Kevin Esveld are doing really fantastic things there, of like giving, kind of like giving access to data, but also kind of like trying to verify a little bit more that we're not perhaps escalating into some dangerous biorisk territories. So I think it depends on the use case, really.
I think we have another question from an audience member just over here.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Christofferson from the Rita Allen Foundation, and I want to thank you for this very interesting and wonderful discussion today, and for hosting this. I particularly want to lean into the call to action for investing in people. When you talk about breaking down silos, building bridges, creating trust, and if there are exemplars in academia or for early career folks to become involved in this, because we have an urgent need to accelerate this. So I'm also interested if there are models that could potentially be open sourced or be more accessible to folks. Thank you.
I have one comment, and I would say that one of the things that is quite clear, I'm trained as a molecular biologist, but see myself as a data scientist because that's what I've been doing all my life. But one of the things that's very clear is that the data scientists and the experimental scientists, they need to close in on each other and not sort of they have to, both of them, accept that this is a new reality. And I think that all has to start already at the university, so when we educate people that they understand that data science and the experimental science, that is now one, that is not a divide. That's where it starts. And then over time, that will migrate all the way up to the people who manage the companies and understand that this is really, it's not either computed data or experimental data, it's one.
I mean, I would say the three domains needed is engineering, data science, and the domain understand, so biology or chemistry. Yeah. And that's the interface, that's the sweet spot.
I would add to that we need to encourage the right mindset into our younger generation, that they have the ability to create their own company and go out there and do what they really believe will be basically a very successful application of technology, biotechnology or something. It's something that really shocked me when I did my postdoc in the US. It's a lot of people were considering after their PhD basically to fund their startup. I mean, it was a Silicon Valley, so it was Stanford.
After their PhD, not before.
They were starting, in fact, before. They were all having some kind of written business plan. A bit like if you're in UCLA, you have basically a script that you... Over there was a business plan. It was a big culture shock compared to Europe. People were not thinking along those lines. It's like they were thinking, okay, I will find a job after that. I will become an employee somewhere. And that, I found it a bit sad, in a way, that we have brilliant mind due to the fact that we have free education in most countries in Europe. We see the talent going basically massively. I mean, Germans, French, British, everybody, all Europe basically are going to this big company in the US and in Europe. So we do have the brightest mind here also, but we are not funding enough company, I find. It's a bit of the odd, let's say, summary I'm able to make. Is that
I would love to keep this conversation going because clearly there's a lot more to say, but perhaps it makes sense to kind of end where it begins, which is in all of our minds. We've heard today about how generative AI will be so transformative for therapy development, that we can do it at scale and yield some big changes over time, that it is not one tool, but many tools, depending on how we might like to use it, that the data we use in these tools is absolutely critical, how we treat that data, how we make it available to each other. And in the future, we are going to need a lot of social and institutional innovation to make best use of this data, including breaking down silos, examining things like bioethics issues, and most of all, we ended on the point that we need to focus on our people who are trained in the technologies for the future workforce, people who are supported, and people have other options other than perhaps starting their own business immediately before they finish their PhD. I hope you'll all join me in thanking our panelists so much for a really amazing conversation. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.